The vanishing reflection. Before we start, just a reminder, if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get to the video. The discovery. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the basement archives of the Niagara Falls Historical Society, casting a sterile glow over rows of filing cabinets and storage boxes that held over a century of local history. Margaret Chen adjusted her white cotton gloves and carefully lifted another photograph. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and Margaret had been working through the collection for 3 weeks as part of her research on early 20th century tourism photography at Niagara Falls. As a professor of photographic history at the University of Toronto, she had seen thousands of vintage photographs, but something about this particular image made her pause. The sepia-toned photograph, measuring roughly 8 inches, showed 2 young women standing side by side at what appeared to be Prospect Point, with the American Falls cascading majestically in the background. The image bore the telltale signs of age, slight fading, small cracks along the edges, and the warm brown tones characteristic of early silver gelatine prints. The women were clearly twins, perhaps in their early 20s, dressed in the fashion. They wore matching light-colored dresses that fell to their ankles, elegant wide-brimmed hats adorned with ribbons, and small handbags clutched in their gloved hands. Their faces were nearly identical, both bearing bright smiles as they posed for what was likely a once-in-a-lifetime tourist photograph. Margaret held the photograph up to the light, examining the technical quality. The composition was well-balanced, with the photographer having positioned the subjects to take advantage of the natural lighting created by the mist and spray from the falls. The depth of field was impressive for the era, keeping both the women and the background waterfall in sharp focus. "Interesting piece," came a voice from behind her. Margaret turned to see James Morrison, the Society's chief archivist, approaching with a cup of coffee in hand. James had been working with the collection for over 30 years and had an encyclopedic knowledge of the local photographic history. "Do you know anything about this one?" Margaret asked, showing him the photograph. James adjusted his reading glasses and studied the image carefully. "Ah, yes. That's from the Henderson collection." Thomas Henderson was a local photographer who specialized in tourist portrait from about 1900. He had a studio on Rainbow Boulevard, and he'd often take customers down to the various viewpoints for scenic shots. "Any information about the subjects? Let me check the documentation." James walked over to a nearby filing cabinet and pulled out a manila folder. Henderson was meticulous about his records. "Here we are. This photograph is dated July 5th. The subjects are listed as the Whitmore sisters, visiting from Boston. No first name, unfortunately, but there's a notation that they were staying at the Cataract House Hotel." Margaret nodded, making notes in her research journal. The Cataract House had been one of the premier hotels in the area during the early 1900s, catering to wealthy tourists who came to experience the wonder of Niagara Falls. "Is there a negative for this image?" she asked. James consulted his folder again. "There should be. Henderson's negative is stored separately in the climate-controlled room. Would you like me to retrieve it?" "Please. I'm particularly interested in examining the technical aspects of early tourist photography, and having access to the original negative would be invaluable." While James went to locate the negative, Margaret continued her examination of the photograph. She noticed small details that spoke to the era. The quality of the women's clothing suggested they came from a well-to-do family. The professional composition indicated this was a formal portrait, rather than a casual snapshot, and the pristine condition of their outfits suggested the photograph was taken early in their visit, before the mist and spray from the falls could dampen their clothing. 20 minutes later, James returned, carrying a flat archival box. "Found it," he announced, setting the box down on the examination table. "Henderson used glass plate negatives, so we'll need to be extra careful." Margaret watched as James carefully removed a 5x7-inch glass plate negative from its protective sleeve. Even in the negative format, the image was remarkably clear and detailed. The glass plate photography technique, while more cumbersome than film, produced images of exceptional quality and longevity. Would it be possible to make a high-resolution scan of this negative? Margaret asked. I'm working on a paper about the evolution of tourist photography techniques, and this would be an excellent example of early professional work. Absolutely. We have a specialized scanner for glass plates upstairs. It'll take about an hour to complete a full scan at archival resolution. As they prepared to move the negative upstairs, Margaret took one last look at the photograph. Something about it continued to intrigue her, though she couldn't quite identify what. Perhaps it was the perfect symmetry of the twin sisters, or the way the photographer had captured the raw power of the falls as a backdrop to their delicate femininity. The scanning process was meticulous. The glass plate negative was positioned on a specialized flatbed scanner designed specifically for archival materials. James adjusted the settings to capture maximum detail, while ensuring the scanning lights wouldn't damage the century-old emulsion. This scanner can capture details that aren't visible to the naked eye, James explained, as the machine hummed to life. Sometimes we discover things in old photographs that the original viewers never noticed. Margaret watched the progress bar slowly advance across the computer screen. The high-resolution scanning process revealed every grain of the photographic emulsion, every subtle gradation of tone, every minute detail that Thomas Henderson had captured on. When the scan was complete, Margaret leaned forward to examine the digital image on the monitor. The level of detail was extraordinary. She could see individual water droplets in the mist, the texture of the women's clothing, even the small imperfections in the glass plate itself. But as she studied the image more closely, something caught her attention. In the lower portion of the photograph, where the mist from the falls created a reflective surface on the wet rocks, she could see what appeared to be reflections of the two women. James, could you zoom in on this area? She asked, pointing to the bottom of the image. James manipulated the software, enlarging the section Margaret had indicated. As the image expanded, both of them fell silent. In the reflection created by the wet rocks and mist, only one of the twin sisters was visible. That's unusual, James said quietly, adjusting the contrast and brightness to get a clearer view. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She had examined thousands of photographs throughout her career, and she had never seen anything like this. The two women were clearly standing side by side in the main image, but in the natural reflection below, only the sister on the left appeared. Could this be a technical issue with the scanning process? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. James shook his head. The scanner doesn't create or remove elements from the image. It only captures what's already there. He paused, studying the screen intently. Let me check the original photograph again. They returned to the archives, where James carefully re-examined the physical photograph under a high-powered magnifying glass. After several minutes of careful inspection, he looked up with a puzzled expression. It's the same in the original. In the reflection area, there's only one figure visible. Margaret felt her academic skepticism warring with the evidence before her eyes. As a scholar, she was trained to look for logical explanations, but this defied conventional understanding of how photography worked. Could the reflection have been obscured by the angle of the light, or perhaps by the movement of the water? She suggested. Possibly, James replied, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But look at the clarity of the reflection that is visible. If lighting or water movement were the issue, we'd expect to see some distortion or partial visibility of the second figure. Margaret made detailed notes about their discovery, including the exact time and conditions of their examination. As a researcher, she knew the importance of documenting every aspect of unusual findings. James, I'd like to research this further. Are there any other photographs from the same session, or any additional documentation about the Whitmore sisters? James consulted his files again. This appears to be the only photograph of them in our collection, but I can check with some of the other local historical societies. Sometimes families donated materials to multiple institutions. As Margaret prepared to leave that evening, she couldn't shake the image from her mind. The missing reflection challenged everything she understood about photography in optics. Light behaved according to physical laws. If two people were standing in the same location under the same conditions, the reflections should both be visible. She decided to take a copy of the high-resolution scan with her for further analysis. Perhaps with more advanced software and additional time, she could find a logical explanation for what they had observed. But as she drove home through the autumn evening, Margaret couldn't escape the feeling that she had stumbled upon something that would challenge not only her understanding of photography, but possibly her understanding of reality itself. The photograph of the Whitmore sisters, with its impossible missing reflection, would prove to be the beginning of an investigation that would consume the next several months of her life and lead her into territories she had never imagined exploring. Margaret spent the entire night analyzing the digitally scan of the Henderson photograph. Her home office, typically organized and serene, had transformed into a chaotic workspace filled with printouts, reference books, and multiple computer monitors displaying various enhanced versions of the image. Using professional photo analysis software, she had isolated the reflection area and applied every enhancement technique she knew. She adjusted contrast, manipulated brightness levels, applied noise reduction filters, and even used infrared spectrum analysis tools. No matter what she tried, the result remained the same. In the reflection, only one of the twin sisters was visible. At 3:47 a.m., Margaret finally admitted defeat and tried to get some sleep, but her mind continued racing, cycling through possible explanations. Could there have been a flaw in the glass plate negative? Was it possible that one of the women had been added to the photograph later through double exposure? But the technical quality of the image and the seamless integration of both figures made such manipulation highly unlikely with 19th-century technology. The next morning, Margaret called her colleague Dr. Robert Hayes at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Robert was one of the world's leading experts in historical photography analysis and had consulted on several high-profile cases involving questioned documents and potentially fraudulent historical images. Margaret, good to hear from you. Robert's voice crackled through the phone. What can I do for you? I've encountered something unusual. Robert, I'm working with an Interium to the 15 photograph that appears to show an impossible optical phenomenon. Would you be willing to take a look? Impossible optical phenomenon, or my specialty, Robert chuckled. Send me the files, and I'll give you my professional opinion. Margaret transmitted the high-resolution scans, along with her preliminary analysis notes. She knew that Robert's examination would be thorough and objective. If anyone could find a rational explanation, it would be him. While waiting for Robert's response, Margaret decided to research the Whitmore sisters themselves. She spent the morning at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library, searching through genealogical records, newspaper archives, and city directories from the Boston area. The search proved more challenging than expected. Whitmore was a relatively common surname, and without first names, Margaret had to examine dozens of potential matches. However, after 3 hours of meticulous research, she found a promising lead. In the July 20, 1932, in the Yosemite de la Isolare, she discovered a small social notice. Miss Eleanor Whitmore and Miss Catherine Whitmore of Beacon Hill have returned from their holiday excursion to Niagara Falls, where they celebrated their 21st birthday. Margaret felt a surge of excitement. The dates matched perfectly with the Henderson photograph, and the mention of twins celebrating their birthday provided additional confirmation. She continued searching and found the sisters listed in the 1915 Boston City Directory. Whitmore, Eleanor and Catherine, daughters of Harold Whitmore. Harold Whitmore, it turned out, was a prominent Boston attorney with considerable wealth derived from textile investments. The family was well established in Boston society, which explained how the sisters could afford a luxury trip to Niagara Falls, and professional photography services. Margaret's phone rang as she was copying the relevant documents. "Margaret, this is fascinating material." Robert's voice carried a note of excitement. "I've been analyzing your photograph for the past 2 hours, and I have to admit, I'm stumped. What did you find?" "Well, first the good news. This is definitely an authentic Gentino 215 photograph. The emulsion characteristics, grain structure, and chemical composition all match the period perfect. There's no evidence of digital manipulation, and the technical quality is consistent with professional glass plate photography of the era." Margaret felt both relief and apprehension. "And the bad news? The missing reflection defies every principle of optics I know. I've run the image through spectral analysis, examined the light angles, and even consulted with a physicist colleague. Based on the positioning of the subjects and the reflective surface, both women should absolutely be visible in the reflection." Robert paused, and Margaret could hear him typing in the background. "There's something else," he continued. "I enhanced the reflection area using some new software we've been developing. The reflection that is visible shows perfect detail and clarity. It's not distorted or partially obscured. It's simply as if the second woman wasn't there when the reflection was formed." Margaret felt a chill. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I think this warrants further investigation." "Have you been able to identify the subjects?" Margaret shared her research about Eleanor and Catherine Whitmore, including the family background and the timing of their visit. "Excellent work," Robert said. "I think our next step should be to find out what happened to the sisters after." Sometimes biographical information can provide context for unusual photographic phenomena. After ending the call, Margaret returned to her research with renewed focus. She expanded her search to include marriage records, obituaries, and any other documentation that might trace the lives of Eleanor and Catherine Whitmore beyond their 21st birthday trip to Niagara Falls. The search proved both fruitful and disturbing. Eleanor Whitmore appeared in numerous social records throughout the 19th. She married a prominent Boston banker named Charles Ashford in 1998, had 3 children, and lived a typical upper-class life until her death. And Catherine Whitmore, however, seemed to vanish from all records after July 1999. Margaret found no marriage records, no death certificate, no further mentions in social columns or city directories. It was as if Catherine had simply ceased to exist after returning from Niagara Falls. This discovery prompted Margaret to dig deeper into the Whitmore family history. She contacted the Boston Public Library's research department and requested assistance with accessing private family papers and estate records. 3 days later, she received a call from Linda Patterson, a genealogical researcher in Boston. "Dr. Chen, I found some interesting information about the Whitmore family," Linda said. "Harold Whitmore's estate papers are held at the Massachusetts Historical Society. According to the inventory, there are several boxes of family correspondence and personal documents. Did you find any mention of Catherine after?" The estate papers include extensive correspondence between Harold Whitmore and various family members from 1915 onwards, but Catherine is never mentioned again after July of that year. It's as if she simply disappeared from the family's consciousness. Linda paused before continuing. "There's something else. I found a letter from Harold Whitmore to his attorney dated August 15. In it, he mentions the tragic loss of our dear Catherine and requests that her name be removed from all family legal documents." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. "Does the letter specify what happened to her?" "No, it's quite vague, but there's a reference to the incident at the falls and a request for complete discretion in the matter." This new information cast the mysterious photograph in an entirely different light. If Catherine Whitmore had died during or shortly after the trip to Niagara Falls, could the missing reflection somehow be connected to her fate? Margaret realized she needed to visit Boston to examine the Whitmore family papers in person. But first, she wanted to return to Niagara Falls. to investigate the specific location where the photograph had been taken. That evening, she called James Morrison at the Historical Society. "James, I need to visit the exact spot where the Henderson photograph was taken. Based on the background, it appears to be Prospect Point, but I'd like to confirm the precise location." "I can help with that," James replied. "I've been thinking about your discovery. I did some research of my own." He found Henderson's business records, which include detailed notes about his photography locations. According to his log, the Whitmore sisters' photograph was taken from the observation platform at Prospect Point, approximately 15 feet from the railing, facing southwest toward the American Falls. "Is that location still accessible?" "Yes, though the observation area has been modified several times over the past century. The basic BB point remains the same, but the railings and platforms have been updated for safety." Margaret arranged to meet James at Prospect Point the following morning. She wanted to examine the location in person, to understand the lighting conditions and reflective surface that would have been present in Min. As she prepared for the site visit, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that she was investigating more than just an unusual photograph. The disappearance of Catherine Whitmore, from all historical records, combined with the impossible missing reflection, suggested a mystery that went far beyond photographic anomaly. She spent the evening reviewing everything she had learned: the technical analysis, confirming the photograph's authenticity, the biographical research, revealing Catherine's mysterious disappearance, and the family correspondence hinting at a tragic incident at Niagara Falls. Whatever had happened to Catherine Whitmore in July 1915, Margaret was becoming convinced that the photograph held crucial evidence. The missing reflection wasn't just an optical impossibility, it might be a clue to a century-old mystery that had been waiting for someone to notice and investigate. As she fell asleep that night, Margaret's dreams were filled with images of twin sisters standing at the edge of a great waterfall, one casting a reflection and one casting none, while the roar of falling water echoed through time. The morning mist rose from Niagara Falls like ghostly fingers reaching toward the sky as Margaret and James made their way to Prospect Point. The autumn air was crisp, and the reduced tourist season meant they had the observation area largely to themselves. James carried a leather portfolio containing Henderson's original business records and a modern surveying tool to help identify the exact position where the 1915 photograph had been taken. According to Henderson's notes, James said, consulting a yellowed page, he positioned his camera here. He pointed to a spot approximately 15 feet back from the current railing. Of course, the observation platform has been rebuilt several times since then, but the basic geography remains the same. Margaret studied the view, comparing it to the photograph she had memorized in detail. The angle was correct. The American Falls cascaded in the background exactly as shown in the image. She could see how the mist and spray would create reflective surfaces on the wet rocks below, just as captured in the Henderson photograph. The lighting conditions would have been similar now, she observed, noting how the morning sun created the same interplay of light and shadow that appeared in the 1915 image. James set up his surveying equipment and began taking precise measurements. He wanted to map the exact sight, lines, and angles. If we're going to understand what happened with that reflection, we need to recreate the conditions as accurately as possible. While James worked, Margaret walked along the observation area, studying the way light reflected off the various wet surfaces created by the fall's mist. She noticed that the reflective properties varied depending on the angle of view and the intensity of the spray. "James, look at this," she called, pointing to a section of wet rock where the reflection of the railing was clearly visible. "The reflection is perfect from this angle, but if I move just a few feet to either side, it becomes distorted or disappears entirely." James joined her, following her gaze. "You're right. The reflective surface is much more sensitive to positioning than I would have expected. They spent the next hour documenting the reflective properties of various surfaces around the observation area. Margaret took dozens of photographs from different angles, noting how even small changes in position could dramatically affect what appeared in the reflections. "This is helpful," Margaret said, reviewing her digital images, "but it still doesn't explain how one person could be missing from a reflection while standing in the exact same location as another person." As they prepared to leave, James received a phone call. Margaret could hear only his side of the conversation, but his increasingly excited tone caught her attention. "That's incredible. Yes, we'll be right there. Don't let anyone else handle it until we arrive." "What was that about?" Margaret asked as James ended the call. "That was my assistant, Karen. She's been going through some recently donated materials, and she found something related to the Whitmore sisters. A local family just donated their grandfather's papers, and apparently he worked at the Cataract House Hotel." They hurried back to the Historical Society, where Karen Walsh, a young graduate student in history, was waiting with barely contained excitement. "Dr. Chen, you're going to want to see this," Karen said, leading them to a table where several documents were carefully laid out. "These papers belong to William Crawford, who was the assistant manager at the Cataract House. In faded ink were the signatures, Miss Eleanor Whitmore and Miss Catherine Whitmore, Boston, Massachusetts." "That's not the exciting part," Karen continued, flipping through a separate notebook. "Crawford kept detailed personal notes about unusual incidents at the hotel. Look at this entry." Margaret leaned forward to read the handwritten text, dated July 6. "Miss Catherine became violently ill during the night and was found by housekeeping in a state of delirium, speaking of the woman in the water and insisting that her reflection had been stolen by the falls. Dr. Morrison was summoned, but Miss Catherine's condition deteriorated rapidly. She passed away at 3:17 a.m. despite all efforts." Miss Eleanor was inconsolable and insisted that something supernatural had occurred during their visit to the falls yesterday. "The family has requested complete discretion, and Mr. Whitmore arrived this morning to make arrangements. Most peculiar case I have encountered in my years of hotel management." The room fell silent as the implications of Crawford's notes sank in. Catherine Whitmore had died at the Cataract House on July 16, just one day after the photograph was taken. "There's more," Karen said softly, turning to another page. "Crawford made a follow-up entry 2 days later." Margaret read the second entry. "Mr. Harold Whitmore departed this morning with Miss Eleanor and the remains of Miss Catherine. Before leaving, Miss Eleanor approached me privately and made the most extraordinary claim. She insisted that during their photography session at Prospect Point, Catherine had noticed that her reflection was not appearing in the water below. Miss Eleanor stated that Catherine became increasingly agitated about this phenomenon and spent the evening in a state of extreme distress, convinced that the absence of her reflection was an omen of impending death. While I am not given to superstitious beliefs, I must admit that Miss Catherine's rapid decline and death so soon after this alleged incident is most unsettling." Margaret felt a chill run through her body. The missing reflection in the Henderson photograph wasn't just an optical anomaly, it had been noticed by Catherine herself on the day the photograph was taken. "This changes everything," she said quietly. Catherine Whitmore was aware that her reflection was missing, and she died less than 24 hours later. James was examining the hotel register more closely. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a notation next to Catherine's signature. "There's a small mark here. It looks like Crawford had made a note." Karen retrieved a magnifying glass, and they could see that Crawford had written "Deceased 7/16" in tiny script next to Catherine's name. He was documenting her death right in the guest register, Margaret observed. This must have been a significant event for the hotel. Margaret's phone buzzed with a text message from Robert Hayes. "Call me immediately. I found something important about the photograph. She stepped outside to make the call, her mind reeling from the discoveries of the past hour. Robert, what did you find? Margaret, I've been analyzing the photograph using some new spectral analysis techniques. I found something that's going to sound impossible, but I've verified it multiple times. What is it? The woman whose reflection is missing. There are subtle but measurable differences in how light interacts with her image compared to her sister. It's as if she's slightly translucent, not visible to the red eye, but detectably through advanced analysis. Margaret felt the ground seem to shift beneath her feet. What are you saying? I'm saying that the photographic evidence suggests that one of the women was already in some kind of transitional state when the photograph was taken. The missing reflection might not be an optical anomaly. It might be evidence of something far more extraordinary. Margaret shared the information they had just discovered about Catherine's death and her awareness of the missing reflection. Robert was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, I think we're dealing with something that goes beyond conventional photography or optics. The evidence suggests that Catherine Whitmore was somehow departing even while the photograph was being taken. Departing, I don't know how else to describe it. But the photographic evidence combined with the historical documentation you found suggests that Catherine was in some kind of liminal state, caught between life and death when Henderson captured that image. After ending the call, Margaret returned to the archives, where James and Karen were continuing to examine Crawford's papers. I found something else, Karen announced. Crawford mentions that other guests reported unusual phenomena around the time of Catherine's death. Strange sounds in the hallways, unexplained cold spots, and several guests claimed to see a young woman in period dress walking the hotel corridors, even after Catherine's body had been removed. Margaret realized that their investigation had moved far beyond the realm of photographic analysis. They were now dealing with evidence that suggested Catherine Whitmore's death had been preceded by supernatural phenomena that had somehow been captured in Henderson's photograph. We need to contact Eleanor's descendants, Margaret said. If Eleanor lived until 1967, there might be family members who have additional information about what happened during that trip to Niagara Falls. James nodded. I'll help you trace Eleanor's family line. If there are living relatives, they might have family stories or documents that could shed more light on this mystery. As they prepared to expand their investigation, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that they were uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden for over a century. The missing reflection in the Henderson photograph wasn't just an optical impossibility, it was evidence of a supernatural event that had been witnessed, documented, and then carefully concealed by the Whitmore family. The photograph, that had initially intrigued her as a curious anomaly, was proving to be a window into a mystery that challenged everything she thought she knew about the boundaries between life and death, between the visible and invisible worlds. And somewhere in the mist and spray of Niagara Falls, the echo of Catherine Whitmore's final day continued to resonate through time. Margaret's flight to Boston landed at Logan International Airport on a gray November morning. She had spent the previous week coordinating with genealogical researchers and had successfully located Eleanor Whitmore, Ashford's granddaughter, Patricia Ashford Reynolds, who lived in a restored Victorian home in Cambridge. Patricia had agreed to meet with Margaret after learning about the discovery of the Henderson photograph and the investigation into her great-aunt Catherine's mysterious death. In their initial phone conversation, Patricia had hinted that the family possessed documents related to the 19th century that had never been shared with outside researchers. The Ashford Reynolds home on Brattle Street was an elegant and three-story Victorian, surrounded by mature oak trees, whose bare branches created intricate patterns against the overcast sky. Patricia, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes, greeted Margaret at the front door. Dr. Chen, thank you for making the trip. I must admit, your call stirred up family memories that we've kept private for generations. Patricia led Margaret into a comfortable study lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A fire crackled in the fireplace, and the room had the warm, scholarly atmosphere of a space dedicated to preserving family history. Before we begin, Patricia said, settling into a leather armchair. I need to understand your intention. That story has remained within our family for over a century, and there are reasons why it was never made public. Margaret explained her research into early 20th century photography and how the Henderson photograph had led to the discovery of Catherine's mysterious death. She emphasized her commitment to handling any sensitive information with appropriate discretion. Patricia studied Margaret for a long moment, then rose and walked to an antique secretary desk in the corner of the room. She retrieved a wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl and returned to her chair. This box contains documents that my grandmother Eleanor left with specific instructions. They were only to be opened if someone ever discovered the truth about Catherine's death and came asking the right questions. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as Patricia opened the box and removed several items: a leather-bound journal, a collection of letters tied with a faded ribbon, and what appeared to be a small photograph. My grandmother lived with the secret of what happened at Niagara Falls for over 50 years, Patricia began. She never spoke of it openly, but she left these documents as a record of the truth, hoping that someday someone would understand. Patricia handed Margaret a leather journal. This is Eleanor's private diary from 1923. That entries from July detail everything that happened during their trip to Niagara Falls. Margaret opened the journal carefully, noting the elegant handwriting in faded blue ink. She found the entry dated July 15. While posing for the photograph, Catherine noticed that her reflection was not visible in the water below. At first, we thought it might be a trick of the light, but when we moved to different positions, my reflection remained clearly visible, while hers continued to be absent. Catherine became increasingly agitated. As the day progressed, she insisted that the missing reflection was an omen, and she spoke repeatedly of feeling disconnected from herself. By evening, she was in a state of extreme distress, claiming that she could feel herself fading and that something was calling to her from the falls. Margaret looked up from the journal. Eleanor was aware of the missing reflection phenomenon. Patricia nodded. Read the next entry. Margaret turned the page to July 17. 1915, Catherine passed away at 3:17 this morning. The hotel physician could find no medical cause for her rapid decline. She spent her final hours speaking of the woman in the water who was beckoning to her. In her delirium, she claimed that her reflection had been taken as a sign that she was meant to join the spirits of the falls. I am devastated by the loss of my dear sister, but I am also terrified by what I witnessed. Catherine's death was not natural. It was somehow connected to the supernatural phenomena we encountered at Prospect Point. I have decided that this truth must be preserved, but never spoken aloud, for fear that others might not understand or might seek to exploit these mysterious forces. Margaret felt a chill as she read Eleanor's account. The diary entries corroborated everything they had discovered in Crawford's hotel records, but they provided much more detail about Catherine's mental state and her apparent awareness of supernatural forces. There's more, Patricia said, handing Margaret a collection of letters. These are correspondence between Eleanor and various spiritualists and paranormal researchers from the 90s. After Catherine's death, Eleanor became obsessed with understanding what had happened. Margaret examined the letters, noting correspondences with prominent figures in the early 20th century spiritualist movement. Eleanor had consulted with mediums, psychical researchers, and experts in supernatural phenomena, all in an attempt to understand her sister's death. One letter dated March 3, 1923, was particularly revealing. It was from Dr. Edmund Hartwell, a professor of psychical research at Harvard University. Dear Miss Ashford, I have reviewed your account of the events at Niagara Falls in July 9. The phenomenon you describe, the absence of reflection preceding death, has been documented in various cultures throughout history. In Celtic folklore, it is believed that those who are about to die lose their reflection as their soul begins to separate from their physical form. The location of this occurrence is also significant. Niagara Falls has long been considered a place of spiritual power by indigenous peoples, and there have been numerous reports of supernatural phenomena in the area. It is possible that your sister was sensitive to these forces, and that her impending death made her visible to entities that exist between the physical and spiritual worlds. Margaret looked up from the letter. Eleanor spent years trying to understand what happened to Catherine. Yes, Patricia confirmed. And she eventually came to believe that Catherine had been chosen by supernatural forces associated with the falls. The missing reflection was a sign that Catherine was being called to join the spirits as those who had died in the waters. Patricia then handed Margaret the small photograph from the box. It was another image of the twin sisters, but this one appeared to have been taken earlier in their trip, possibly at their hotel. Look closely at this photograph, Patricia instructed. Margaret examined the image carefully. Both sisters were clearly visible and appeared normal, but as she studied it more closely, she noticed something subtle. Catherine appeared slightly blurred, as if she had moved during the exposure, while Eleanor was perfectly sharp. When was this taken? According to Eleanor's notes, this was taken on July 14, the day before the Henderson photograph. Eleanor believed that Catherine was already beginning to fade even before they visited Prospect Point. Margaret realized that the evidence was building a compelling case for supernatural phenomena surrounding Catherine's death. The photographic evidence, the historical documentation, and now Eleanor's private records all pointed to the same conclusion. Catherine Whitmore had experienced some kind of supernatural calling that had ultimately led to her death. Patricia, why are you sharing this information with me now? Your family has kept a secret for over a century. Patricia was quiet for a moment, gazing into the fire. Because I believe Catherine's story deserves to be told, and because there have been other incidents over the years that suggest this phenomenon is not unique to my family. Other incidents? Eleanor kept track of unusual deaths and disappearances at Niagara Falls throughout her lifetime. She documented dozens of cases where people reported seeing figures in the mist, experiencing supernatural phenomena, or having their reflections behave strangely before tragic accidents occurred. Patricia retrieved another folder from the box. Eleanor believed that Niagara Falls was a kind of portal where the boundary between life and death was thinner than in other places. She thought that sensitive individuals could be called by the spirits of those who had died in the waters. Margaret examined Eleanor's research files, which contained newspaper clippings, personal testimonies, and correspondence with other families who had experienced similar losses. The documentation spanned nearly 50 years and included dozens of cases with eerily similar elements, missing reflections, supernatural sightings, and unexplained deaths or disappearances. This is extraordinary, Margaret said. Eleanor compiled evidence of a pattern of supernatural phenomena at Niagara Falls, spanning decades. Yes, but she never published her findings. She was afraid that making this information public might attract the wrong kind of attention to the falls, or that it might put other sensitive individuals at risk. As Margaret continued to review the documents, she realized that her investigation had uncovered not just the mystery of Catherine Whitmore's death, but evidence of a much larger phenomenon that had been occurring at Niagara Falls for generations. The Henderson photograph, with its impossibly missing reflection, was not an isolated anomaly but part of a pattern of supernatural activity that had been carefully documented and deliberately concealed by those who had witnessed it. Patricia, what do you think should be done with this information? Patricia considered the question carefully. I think Catherine's story should be told, but with respect for the mystery and power of what occurred. This isn't just a historical curiosity, it's evidence of forces that we don't fully understand, forces that continue to exist at Niagara Falls today. As Margaret prepared to return to Toronto, she realized that her investigation had evolved far beyond academic research. She was now the keeper of a century-old secret that challenged conventional understanding of life, death, and the supernatural forces that might exist in the spaces between. The Henderson photograph had opened the door to a hidden history of Niagara Falls, and Margaret was beginning to understand that some mysteries were meant to be preserved rather than solved. Margaret returned to Niagara Falls on a cold December morning, carrying with her copies of Eleanor's research and a new understanding of the supernatural forces that had claimed Catherine Whitmore's life. The tourist season was over, and the falls were shrouded in winter mist that created an otherworldly atmosphere perfectly suited to her investigation. She had arranged to meet with James Morrison, Robert Hayes, who had driven up from Rochester to examine the site with the new information they had uncovered. Margaret had also invited Sarah Blackwood, a professor of folklore and paranormal studies from the University of Buffalo, whose expertise in supernatural phenomena would be valuable in interpreting Eleanor's research. The four researchers gathered at Prospect Point as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the observation area. The winter conditions had reduced the number of visitors to nearly zero, giving them privacy to conduct their investigation. Based on Eleanor's documentation, Margaret began, spreading out copies of the research on a portable table. Catherine's experience was part of a much larger pattern of supernatural activity. At this location, Dr. Blackwood examined Eleanor's files with obvious fascination. This is remarkably documentation. Eleanor Whitmore essentially conducted a 50-year study of paranormal phenomena at Niagara Falls. Look at these patterns. She pointed to a timeline Eleanor had created, showing incidents of supernatural sightings, unexplained deaths, and missing persons, cases spanning from near-Tuesday to... There's a clear correlation between certain atmospheric conditions and the frequency of reported phenomena. Dr. Blackwood continued. Most incidents occur during periods of high mist and low visibility, particularly in the early morning or late evening hours. Robert had brought specialized photographic equipment to the site, including infrared cameras and electromagnetic field detectors. He wants to see if we can capture any evidence of the phenomena that Eleanor documented. As they set up their equipment, James shared additional historical information he had discovered. I've been researching indigenous legends about this area. The Haudenosaunee people have stories about spirits that inhabit the falls, particularly the spirits of those who have died in the waters. They believe that certain individuals could be called by these spirits to join them. Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. Catherine might have been sensitive to these spiritual forces. Dr. Blackwood nodded. In many cultures, twins are believed to have special spiritual sensitivity. It's possible that Catherine was more susceptible to supernatural influences than the average person. As darkness fell, the researchers began their systematic investigation of the site. Robert's infrared cameras revealed temperature variations in the mist that seemed to form recognizable shapes, and his electromagnetic detectors registered unusual fluctuations in the area where the Henderson photograph had been taken. There's definitely something here, Robert announced, studying his readings. The electromagnetic field is behaving in ways that don't match normal atmospheric conditions. Margaret positioned herself at the exact spot where Catherine and Eleanor had posed for their photograph, and as she looked down at the reflective surfaces created by the mist and spray, she tried to imagine what Catherine might have experienced in her final hours. Dr. Chen, you need to see this, Dr. Blackwood called urgently. Margaret turned to see Blackwood pointing at one of Robert's infrared monitors. The screen showed a clear image of the observation area, but there was an additional figure visible in the infrared spectrum. A tall, slender form, standing near the railing, exactly where Catherine would have been positioned in the Henderson photograph. Is that equipment malfunction? Margaret asked, though she already suspected the answer. Robert checked his equipment thoroughly. Everything is functioning normally. The infrared camera is detecting a heat signature that's not visible to the naked eye. As they watched, the figure on the monitor seemed to turn toward them, as if aware of their presence. Margaret felt a sudden drop in temperature and an overwhelming sense of sadness that seemed to emanate from the area near the railing. Catherine, Margaret whispered, though she wasn't sure why. The figure on the monitor became more distinct, and Margaret could see what appeared to be a young woman in early 20th century clothing. The image was translucent but clearly defined, and it remained visible for several minutes before gradually fading. Dr. Blackwood was documenting everything with her own equipment. This is consistent with Eleanor's research. She documented numerous sightings of a young woman in period dress at this exact location, particularly during winter months when atmospheric conditions are similar to tonight. Margaret realized that they were witnessing the same phenomenon that had preceded Catherine's death, and the missing reflection in the desapareció photograph had been evidence of Catherine's spiritual transition, and now they were seeing her continued presence at the site where her fate had been sealed. "She's still here," Margaret said quietly. "Catherine never left Niagara Falls." James had been monitoring audio equipment, and he suddenly gestured for silence. Through the speakers they could hear what sounded like whispered voices carried on the wind. The words were indistinct, but the emotional content was unmistakable, a sense of longing and invitation. Eleanor's research mentioned auditory phenomena. Dr. Blackwood noted. Witnesses reported hearing voices calling to them from the mist, particularly individuals who later experienced supernatural encounters. Robert's equipment continued to register unusual readings throughout the night. The electromagnetic fluctuation seemed to follow a pattern, intensifying and then subsiding in regular cycles. The infrared cameras captured multiple instances of unexplained heat signatures, and the audio equipment recorded sounds that had no identifiable natural source. As dawn approached, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. "I want to try something," she announced. Eleanor's research suggests that sensitive individuals can communicate with the spiritual entities at this location. "I want to attempt contact with Catherine." Blackwood looked concerned. "That could be dangerous. Eleanor's documentation shows that spiritual contact at this location can have serious consequences, but it might also provide answers," Margaret replied. "Catherine's story has been hidden for over a century. Maybe it's time for her to tell it herself." Margaret positioned herself at the exact spot where the Henderson photograph had been taken, and closed her eyes, trying to open herself to whatever spiritual forces existed at the location. At first, she felt nothing unusual, but gradually she became aware of a presence, not threatening, but profoundly sad. Images began to form in her mind. Catherine standing at the railing, watching her reflection disappear from the water below. Catherine in her hotel room, feeling herself becoming disconnected from the physical world. Catherine's final moments as she was called to join the spirits of the falls. But there was more. Margaret sensed that Catherine's death had not been random or accidental. She had been chosen because of her spiritual sensitivity, called to serve as a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. The missing reflection had been a sign that she was transiting between realms. "She's trying to tell me something," Margaret said, her eyes still closed. Catherine wants people to understand that her death wasn't a tragedy, it was a calling. She chose to answer the call of the spirits. The presence Margaret felt began to fade as the sun rose higher, but not before she received one final impression. Catherine was at peace, serving as a guardian spirit for others, who might be called by the falls. When Margaret opened her eyes, she found her colleagues watching her with expressions of awe and concern. "What did you experience?" Dr. Blackwood asked. Margaret described the visions and impressions she had received, including Catherine's message about her spiritual calling. "This changes everything," Robert said. "We're not just documenting a historical mystery, we're witnessing an ongoing supernatural phenomenon." As they packed up their equipment, Margaret realized that their investigation had reached a natural conclusion. They had solved the mystery of the missing reflection in the Henderson photograph, uncovered the truth about Catherine Whitmore's death, and documented evidence of continuing supernatural activity at Niagara Falls. But more importantly, they had given Catherine a voice to tell her story after more than a century of silence. The Henderson photograph, with its impossible missing reflection, was no longer just a photographic anomaly. It was a window into a world where the boundaries between life and death, between the physical and spiritual realms were more fluid than most people could imagine. And at Niagara Falls, where the power of nature created a thin veil between worlds, Catherine Whitmore continued her eternal vigil, watching over those who might be called to join the spirits of the mist. 3 months after their supernatural encounter at Prospect Point, Margaret sat in her office at the University of Toronto, staring at the final draft of her research paper. The document represented the most challenging writing project of her academic career. How do you present evidence of supernatural phenomena to a scholarly audience trained in empirical analysis? She had titled the paper Fotográfica Evidence of Paranormal Phenomena, the 1915 Anderson photograph and the Catherine Whitmore case. After extensive deliberation, she had decided to present their findings as a case study in non-explainable photographic anomalies, allowing readers to draw their own conclusions about the supernatural elements. Robert Hayes had co-authored the technical analysis sections, providing detailed documentation of their photographic and electromagnetic findings. Dr. Blackwood had contributed a comprehensive analysis of the folklore and cultural context surrounding Niagara Falls. In it seems Morrison had compiled the historical documentation, creating a timeline of events that traced Catherine's story from the discovery of the photograph to their winter investigation. Margaret's phone rang, interrupting her review of the manuscript. Dr. Chen, this is Patricia Ashford Reynolds. I hope I'm not calling at an inconvenient time. Not at all, Patricia. I was just reviewing our research paper. How can I help you? I've been thinking about our conversation and the investigation you conducted. I believe there's something else you should know, something that might provide additional context for Catherine's story. Margaret felt a familiar surge of curiosity. What kind of additional context? I've been in contact with other family members, sharing what you discovered about Catherine. My cousin in California has family documents that we weren't aware of, including a letter that Catherine wrote to Eleanor just hours before her death. Margaret's pulse quickened. A letter from Catherine, written on July 16. It was found among Eleanor's personal effects after her death in 1977. But it was never mentioned in the family documents I showed you. My cousin just discovered it while organizing some inherited papers. What does the letter say? Patricia paused. I think you should read it yourself. I'm sending you a scan of the original document, but I will say this. It provides a very different perspective on what happened to Catherine. She wasn't a victim of supernatural forces. She was a willing participant. Margaret received the scanned letter within an hour. Written in Catherine's elegant handwriting on Cataract House Hotel, stationery. It was dated July 6. My dearest Eleanor, by the time you read this letter, I will have departed this world to join the spirits that have been calling to me since our visit to Prospect Point. Please do not mourn for me, dear sister, for I go willingly to fulfill a destiny that I now understand was always meant to be mine. The missing reflection that so disturbed us yesterday was not an omen of death, but a sign of my spiritual calling. Throughout the night, I have been visited by the spirits of those who have passed into the waters of Niagara Falls. They have shown me visions of my purpose to serve as a bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the spirits. I know this will be difficult for you to understand, but I have been chosen for this role because of the special bond we share as twins. Our connection will allow me to communicate with you and others from the spiritual realm to provide comfort and guidance to those who are grieving or lost. The photograph, Mr. Henderson, took years to capture the moment of my transition. My reflection was already beginning to fade because my spirit was preparing to cross over. I am not dying, Eleanor, I am transforming. Please tell our parents that I love them and that my choice brings me great peace. Do not let them blame themselves or seek explanations in medicine or science. What is happening to me transcends the physical world. I will watch over our family always, and I will find ways to let you know that I am well and happy in my new existence. Look for signs in reflections, in photographs, in the mist of waterfalls. I will be there. Until we meet again in whatever realm awaits us all. Your loving sister, Catherine. Keep the photograph Mr. Henderson took. It is proof that love transcends death and that some bonds cannot be broken by the passage between worlds. Margaret read the letter 3 times, each reading deepening her understanding of Catherine's experience. This wasn't a story of supernatural victimization, but of spiritual calling and willing sacrifice. She immediately called the other members of their research team to share Catherine's final letter. The revelation recontextualized everything they had discovered and provided a profound conclusion to their investigation. This explains the peaceful presence we felt during our winter investigation, Dr. Blackwood observed during their conference call. Catherine wasn't trapped at Niagara Falls. She was serving as a spiritual guardian. Robert was fascinated by the technical implication. The letter confirms that the missing reflection was evidence of Catherine's spiritual transformation, not a photographic anomaly. She was literally transitioning between realms when Henderson captured that image. James added historical context. This also explains why Eleanor spent decades researching supernatural phenomena at the falls. She was trying to understand Catherine's calling and possibly looking for ways to communicate with her. Margaret realized that their investigation had uncovered something far more significant than a mysterious photograph. They had documented evidence of conscious spiritual transformation, of an individual who had chosen to cross the boundary between life and death to serve a higher purpose. "We need to revise our research paper," Margaret announced. Catherine's letter changes our entire understanding of what we discovered. Over the following weeks, the team reworked their manuscript to incorporate Catherine's own account of her spiritual calling. The revised paper presented the Henderson photograph, not as evidence of supernatural victimization, but as documentation of willing spiritual transformation. Margaret also decided to include a section on the ongoing implications of their discovery. If Catherine's experience was genuine, it suggested that the boundary between life and death might be more permeable than commonly believed, and that certain individuals might be called to serve as bridges between realms.